It was March 15th, 1991, when Richard Grieco stepped out of his 21 Jump Street character to play another high school student, the cocky Michael Corben. And before he can graduate, Michael travels to France on a school trip to earn his missing French credit. But when British intelligence mistakes Michael for a spy of the same name, they rush him to headquarters and assign him to watch over billionaire Augustus Steranko, played by Rees, who they think is in danger of being murdered by a killer who is targeting him. Our mistaken identity high school student discovers that British intelligence got it wrong, and Augustus Steranko is actually the one Michael Corben needs to stop. But will a plethora of espionage, gadgetry, and good looks be enough to help Michael against a handful of cliche villains, beautiful women, and his overbearing French teacher? And the Siskel and Ebert reviews that followed.
Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, two titans of cinematic review. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong, but always captivating. Your hosts Antonio of the Cult-Worthy Cinema Podcast and Justin Henson of the Movie Wire are here to take you back to the balcony.
All right, so there is no rhyme or reason why I'm excited for this episode. I think your reaction when I brought this to the table just encouraged me to be overly excited for this. Not only for your reaction, but your rewatch. And I don't know if it's going to change any minds, but I think this one is going to be a really good conversation. And the reason I brought this one to the table is before I put it on the list, this one was on the TV in my household consistently in the 90s. And this one was almost a tradition of watching it a couple times a year. But it was also hard to find when I wanted to watch it now. And just out of luck, it was like fate that this one hit Tubi probably less than 2 weeks after I put it to the list. So I am excited about it, and I'm just going to jump right into it. How was a rewatch, Antonio? I am dying. I'm just going to cut right to the chase.
Okay, well, I mean, first of all, we were discussing offline that, we should have had our eyebrows microbladed and gotten that mascara gone and got a fake tan and worn our x-ray specs. I got to be honest with you, man. This wasn't as bad as I was fearing it would be, because what this rewatch proved to me is that I don't necessarily dislike this movie as much as I've spent the last 30 years disliking Richard Grieco. That's my hang up. I just don't like the guy. I didn't like the fact that he took over for Johnny Depp on 21 Jump Street back in the day. I had a hard time with that. And the fact that he got his own spin-off from that show, that was hard for me to swallow too. And I've just always thought of him as kind of just like, I don't know, a caricature of the good-looking Hollywood guy. And they do that perfectly in the Butabi Brothers movie, Night at the Roxbury, where Richard Grieco plays just like a hyper-stylized version of himself. And it reminds me of that time of the late 80s, early 90s, where that mentality, that personality was sexy, was attractive. But to me, it's just so phony. And when I realized who was behind this movie, because like I said, it was out of sight, out of mind since probably the year after it came out, I just didn't like the idea of this movie because of Richard Grieco. But then going back and realizing that William Deere directed it, that not only Fred Decker of Night of the Creeps and Monster Squad fame wrote the story, but then Darren Star of Sex and the City was the main screenwriter. I'm like, there's a lot of talent behind this movie. There's a lot of talent in this movie, but I have to deal with Richard Grieco for 90 minutes. Like, that was a hard pill to swallow. But recap, it wasn't as bad as I remembered it. So I'm not going to sit here and piss on the movie the whole time. I will have some very strong opinions, though, about some of the things in the movie.
I get that. I mean, I felt the same way about Macaulay Culkin in the, like, 90s. I hated the kid, and I hated every movie that he was in. To me, it was more of a jealousy thing until I saw him in My Girl, and I bawled my eyes out. Then we were okay.
Yeah.
Um, but here's the thing about this movie, and I'm glad you brought it up because this is a movie of all stereotypical characters. Every character placement in here are typecasted to meet their one individual talent.
Right.
So there is not one character here that doesn't match perfectly when it comes to the characters that they play. And when it comes to Richard Grieco, this one with his character, he was the one that everybody wanted to be per se. He got the girls, he had the looks. He was the again stereotypical character to play a spy and overly done, and that's one word I think we're going to use quite a bit in this is overly done, where even if you look at this guy, he stands out so strongly among the crowd that there is no way this guy is a deep cover agent. He's too tan, he's too good looking, so he fits that stereotypical person to a T. And I think that's what is kind of special to it, and I've always described this movie as what almost Ebert is going to say later, but you have True Lies, that's kind of the fantasy for middle aged men of just that one kind of thing that you just wish you could have been, that daydream. This was that for high school students. This was that for teenagers. This is that one fantasy that we all kind of wanted to place ourselves in and escape for a while. And that's what really kind of drew me into this outlandish story is it was cartoonish enough and out there enough to really fit into that fantasy without taking itself too seriously.
No, I agree with what you're saying. And I don't know if you remember around the same time this movie came out, there was a Saturday morning cartoon called James Bond Jr., which was one of my favorite shows. It didn't last very long, but I love that concept of having like a younger secret agent spy type character. But this is my problem with the dynamic of the movie, and they speak to it in their discourse when they're covering the review of the film. And that is, I think that there is a very specific dynamic that makes a film like this work, and the 80s really knew how to do that. And that is, we are not necessarily all cool in real life. We like to see someone who's a little bit more nerdy or losery be able to get that cool persona, whether it's by mistake or by happenstance or the way the plot goes. So, for example, we all think that Marty McFly is really cool, right? But when you think about it, he isn't. Like, he has this century-long stigma of being a McFly, which is like essentially being shit in the town of Hill Valley. His whole family has a legacy of being losers. So even though we think he's cool because he rides a skateboard, he plays guitar, he's got a cool down vest, what makes him cool is the fact that he actually gets to go back in time, and the things that we find maybe a little nerdy and outlandish in our era at the time is cool for the 1950s. So he gets to be cool by being in a different decade, where in the life he currently lives, he's really not that cool. Honestly, Jennifer's relationship with Marty is really interesting to me. They never really go into how they got together, but you can tell that he's not a popular guy, and she's a smoke show. So he must have a really great personality. I've always wondered about that dynamic. On the same note, C. Thomas Howell in Soul Man, right? He is a very intelligent, educated guy, but it's the finance that's keeping him out of Harvard, which is why he goes through the whole process of changing the skin color and stuff like that. Why we're able to go along the journey with him and sit through that movie and all the interesting circumstances he puts himself through is the fact that even though he is kind of an outlandish asshole, he's still kind of smart and he has a heart. What gets me about this movie is that Richard Grieco is unlikable from the very beginning. Like, he's too cool for school. He's not smart. He's not intelligent. He doesn't have any secret talents, and he has no follow through, as his dad says. And eventually that movie goes through that plot point. Us, as the audience, have a hard time connecting with his base personality once all these things happen to him and he's mistaken for this secret agent. it's like he doesn't deserve the coolness of this movie and the coolness of the role that he's given, because in high school, he's actually kind of an asshole. Like, the girls don't really like him because he's too full of himself and too assholish, right? But he's a party boy. I'm sure he does great with a certain type of lady, but you can tell that he is not an identifiable character because of the way his family talks about him, the fact that he's going to have to take summer school, which his summer school is a trip to France, for $300 a day. It's one of those things that bugged me about this character. And before you jump into there, the one thing that I thought about this movie is, you've seen the film Out of Bounds, right? With Anthony Michael Hall.
Yeah.
He's being chased by hitmen throughout Los Angeles. He's a teenager. I always liked that movie because it is a real, oh shit, this is a nerd being chased by the mob and being thrown into situations where now he can feel dangerous, feel masculine. I'm like, this movie needed a nerdy character. This needed an Anthony Michael Hall or someone like that, even a Michael J. Fox, for me to actually care about this guy and be more invested in his journey throughout the movie. Only to find out that that's the way that Fred Decker wrote it. He actually wrote it for Anthony Michael Hall, who thought he was just a little bit too old to play the part, and they gave it to Richard Grieco instead. So my instincts were right. I didn't know that until today when I started researching it. So I feel like we're watching two different movies here, where we have the movie itself with the villains and the mistaken identities and all those great action scenes and moments of coolness, but we just got the wrong character to follow through this movie. That's how I feel about it.
Yeah, I'll agree and disagree on a couple different things. One, to me, I think they would have fallen into, if we had that nerdy character, Superman syndrome, where we have this nerdy character that's relatable. Then the second half will go into the debate of it just didn't work, because picturing a Michael J. Fox type character running from the rooftops in a helicopter, not knowing how the hell he got that athletic to make that happen, that would be a whole other conversation. When it comes to the Greco character, now this is where I will agree to disagree. Is I think in the beginning, the movie sets it up as a dislikable character intentionally. We want to see this character fail high school because obviously he based his things on partying, his looks, and he's the unlikable high school character that we've all seen, we've all experienced in high school. And he is unlikable. But then we get different elements in it, such as seeing this guy fail, getting laid in a hotel by a areola that gets blown up. So there are elements here that are inserted to not make us feel good about the transition that we see him go through. But here's where the movie does fail: is it doesn't continue. He still has that hero element to it, and it could have used more of that to continue that. So we're not supposed to necessarily like him, because that's what the supporting cast is supposed to do. They're supposed to add that cartoonish thing around this stern character that has kind of just flunked out of high school, that is there because he did some things that are very unlikable when it comes to just pure laziness. And he's not smart whatsoever in these situations. So to me, I think yes and no. I think if there would have been a different character, it would have been a different conversation, absolutely. But for what he is, I think if they added in more elements of the dislikability, I think that would have been a different story. But I definitely think the nerdy character would have been a drastic change, and it would have gone to the man that knew too little element. It would have been a little bit more too slapstick. And I think this movie balances it pretty well for what it is. And again, we're going to use the word guilty pleasure quite a bit. And this one, I think, is the guilty pleasure of it because it does balance that extremely well, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, it has all of the formulas for a guilty pleasure movie. I'll give you that 100%. I think that the violence of the movie, for being a PG-13 rated, and here's the thing, it's 1991, right? This movie feels like it has that danger element that mid-1980s movies were really known for, like Temple of Doom being so, violent and graphic, with not only just like the body gore and the violence, but also the famous dinner scene, the gross out factor. There's a lot in this that I was really surprised. You already said the woman, the female henchman, the gorgeous one, gets blown up by a missile, and you see her charred corpse underneath her hair. Like, that was really surprising to me. Like, they went full out. They put the busload of these French students and their teacher in like these very perilous situations. They've got the hitman on the bus, they've got them almost being killed by the missile that he launches from his car, and then being held over a big vat of molten gold at the end. Like, wow, they really went for the violence in this, towards essentially children. I love it. I love all of that. That's where like the guilty pleasure part comes in. I think the part that, again, I'm going to throw all of my disdain for what this movie is completely on Richard Grieco. The dude doesn't have any other emotions than smugness, right? Like, you don't see fear in the moments where he should be afraid. Instead, you just see that, smirking for the camera, raising the eyebrows, sorting out the charm. It almost reminds me of the roles that George Clooney intentionally plays smug, right? Where he has like a one note. It's intentional. He's a great actor. But like Burn After Reading, he is that one note character all the way through. But this is different. This isn't trying to be that. That's just who he is. So in the moments of danger, in the moments where we would have like the hero's journey or the flip where they are going to make the right decision, none of that meant anything to me coming from him because there was no change in emotion. Like you said, it is the supporting cast that does all of that work for him. Gabriel Anwar does a great job making this ridiculous relationship work between them because all that emotion comes from her. The hitmen, the henchmen, their magnetic charm and like Bond villain-esque performances make it fun for us that we're going to forgive that blasé Grieco energy. So that's where I kind of go back to like, this movie actually is a lot of fun and it's got a lot of great stuff to it. It's just, I can't get past and I'm not going to say woodenness, just the one note performance that Grieco puts forward. And when I say Anthony Michael Hall, that's not who I wanted to see in that role, obviously. It is just kind of the archetype that I feel would have worked better because it's like a JD and Scrub situation, right? Like, here's someone who's afraid to be who they are in their normal life, but once they're in this situation where no one knows who they are, it gives them that opportunity to be more and to be more aggressive, be more masculine. And I think that character dynamic would have been more interesting to me and made me like this movie better.
Yeah, and I can't disagree with the Grieco character because he's the Glenn Powell of the 90s that we have now.
You've got a thing for Glenn Powell.
I
I think
hate
it's
Glenn
hilarious.
Powell. God. So he's kind of the one note, only Glenn Powell has more opportunities than Grieco did. But we do see that in Grieco's career that he really had nothing other than B movies coming out after If Looks Could Kill. So he is a one note. There's going to be no argument on that. But when it comes down to the situations that I really did get engulfed in, and I love the fact that you brought up earlier the James Bond Jr., because that's exactly how I love to describe this movie. It's the James Bond Jr. movie that we never got because I love that show as well. And when it comes to a lot of these spy movies that kids didn't get, this was it. And it was borderline R. This one for the US was exactly kind of pushing the limits to what high school and teenagers really wanted to see. And to me, this one, when it comes to the end, when we get to the climax, this is where it's purely defined as a situational guilty pleasure. Is
Mm.
we're not rooting for Grieco, we're not rooting for making sure that he's successful. It's all situation. We're seeing what happens with the situation next. Between the ballroom with the poisonous champagne to the helicopter, the rooftops, there's nothing that made me cheer Rico on, but it's the idea of what he's doing. It's the idea of what these situations are that really got me engulfed into this fantasy, that really got me engulfed into this idea of a spy movie that was made just for me or just for my age bracket in the 1990s. So to me, yeah, you're 100% right. Rico, not a huge fan of. He's a one-hit wonder when it comes to his big motion picture career, and this one I think was the final nail in the coffin. And I think they wanted this movie to really put him on a pedestal to see what he can do, and he wasted it. Um, but luckily, with our writing team and what the movie to me was special, but it wasn't because of Grieco at all. Um, so to me, I think you're right in 100%. But to me, I think this is still an underrated action movie that didn't deserve kind of the release that it had. So,
Yeah.
but I
No, no.
think, yeah.
I will give you the fact that this definitely plays so much better now than the way I remember it because I know more about cinema now. Like recognizing the Fred Decker elements was really exciting for me. So if you've seen Night of the Creeps and you've seen Monster Squad, you understand like how he handles the violence and the tragic situations and dangerous situations that youthful cast members are put through. Like the fact that the guy who steps on the gum gets blown apart and you see his bloody boot there on the floor in a PG-13 movie. I love it. Areola getting completely crisped up. I love it. The squibs that go off of the people in that final scene, like that was really, really fun for me. But I'm going to tell you what I like the most about this movie. I like the fact that they were not going to be shy of really putting the audience in a difficult situation right from the beginning of like, who is my hero? And what I'm talking about is the fact that Roger Daltrey of The Who is supposed to be like the super spy, Blade, Agent Blade. And he's killed in the first 5 minutes of the movie. Linda Hunt essentially whips his neck and snaps it. And I was just taken back to Matthew Vaughn's Kingsman. I was like, there is so much Kingsman in this movie. The fact that we have like this young guy that's brought into the world of secret agents. It's not that he's like got the genetic legacy that Kingsman presents, but once he's in it, he knows how to handle himself. He becomes more adept to being a secret agent. But then you've also got like the legacy part of it where Blade has a daughter, Mariska, played by Gabriel Anwar, gorgeous. And I just love the notes of violence and unexpected death that move this plot forward. I mean, Linda Hunt is an assassin and she's kind of a badass. I love Linda Hunt anyway. And I remembered her in this movie, but I didn't remember how vicious and brutal she was. That is fun to me. That is very against type. Like, that is a Fred Decker thing of like, I'm going to make this 4 foot tall, elderly woman be one of the most deadly assassins in the world, And then, of course, the villain's motivation is very similar to Kingsman as well. He wants to flip the power dynamic. He wants to create his own currency, therefore creating his own country. Like, I love the stakes of this movie. I love the stakes that it puts not only our main character in, but the world in. And the fact that we've got just everyday regular people stuck in it, I like the stakes of it. So all those things to me, the movie did a great job. And William Deere's a good director. The same year he did The Rocketeer, which you and I have both agreed, and many people, especially Josh Scar, agree that it's one of the most underrated action comic book movies of the 90s, maybe of the century. Like, not enough people give that movie enough credit. And it's the same year as this. And it has a very similar kind of feel, vibe of there's fun and there's danger, and the blend of it is perfect.
Well, when it comes to Fred Decker, I mean, if I were to find this movie on one of his other movies, I mean, you can't really debate RoboCop 3. You take the robot assassins or samurais, and then you have the rocket pack. So, I mean, there's a lot of ridiculousness to this movie that really is almost impossible to not get engulfed in when it comes to Linda Hunt. And I swear this is one of my favorite roles to her, and that's going to be probably a huge debate. But to me, when I think of this movie, I think of Linda Hunt because there's nothing more badass in this movie when you take any of the characters than anytime she's on screen when she takes out that necklace whip. She is the most threatening character in this movie and the most
Yeah.
memorable. Every character in this movie is well, except for Greco. Um, every villain, I would say, is really that builds the stakes of what's going to happen next. And I know we're going to hear from our critics here in a minute, and I'm going to have some disagreement with it. but the villains are the ones that really make it. And when we see the off-screen scenes of ridiculousness, from combat condoms to the devil knows you own it, or whatever it is, the song where Ariel is dancing with the scorpion. So these are the ridiculous moments in between these really serious villains that make that situational, that really make that threatening to really follow along with what's going to happen next. And that's kind of what I said earlier, is this one is a complete situational movie driven by the villains, driven by these interesting villains that give us a taste of wanting more especially when it comes to when we watch this as youth.
And that is, I'm going to say, one of the hottest debates that I have with action films of the 80s and 90s is it a blessing or a curse to have your villains be more interesting and entertaining than your protagonist? Like, I think that's where a lot of people do have problems with certain movies. Waterworld's a good example. Kevin Costner's boring as dog shit in that movie, but Dennis Hopper is one of the best villains of all time. Like, I like Waterworld because of Dennis Hopper, not because of Kevin Costner. And we've seen that in so many movies. Another example I like to use is Charles Dance is way too good of a villain for Arnold Schwarzenegger in Last Action Hero. Like, that's another one that I think. And this movie's got three of them because it's got Roger Rees, it's got Linda Hunt, and then it's got Tom Rack as Zigsfield, who is essentially like this kind of like Jason Bourne type assassin, the quiet one that's just out there taking people out. Like, those three are very, very, very dangerous at all moments, but they also have charm and they're just better than the protagonist. And I'm still on the fence of that, of like, is that a hindrance to the film or is that a benefit? And if it's a benefit, I don't think it's intentional. It's just you've got some really great people in some really fun roles doing a lot of great work, and then the rest of the movie has to catch up with it.
Well, and I think the message, if we were to really simplify it, is did you have fun by the end of the movie? To me, yes, the movie is fun. You can nitpick, and we've had, I think, this debate a couple times of we can take one character, one actor, and does it ruin the movie entirely? The answer in this one is no, because it is, at the end of the day, fun to watch. It does engage us a little bit. And we take a lot of these phenomenal characters, it's almost like weighing it, is there's more good characters than bad characters, and that's what really engages a movie. You can't fault a movie for having a single stale performance, even if it's the main character, because when it comes to screen time, he doesn't have the most speaking lines per se. I mean, he's pretty simplistic in his dialogue, as a high school student should be in this situation, but it's what the intelligence of the other ones make it to support him. We've had this conversation with Oscar, where that one was a complete supporting cast role to Stallone that acted around him.
Yeah.
Different genre, but at the same time, that's what really boosts it up. And that's what makes a team environment when it comes to filmmaking, is how are we going to raise the stakes on this? How are we going to make this entertaining for the viewer? And when it comes to the filmmakers, I think they do a fantastic job on doing that, is raising the stakes with everybody else, because I can guarantee you Grieco, within his first week of shooting, the director went around saying, we need to raise the stakes to the supporting cast. We need to support this character and make this more interesting and engaging to the viewer. So, and we see that because these villains are outlandish. It's like, these are the ones I wanted to see on screen. These are the ones I couldn't wait to just snap to. I wasn't excited to see Grieco, and I agree with you on that, but I was excited to see the villains, because that's where the fantasy rolls around, is what is he going to be up against that's really going to make me care? And that to me is the most memorable piece of it. I agree.
Before we get into the reviews of our critics, it's a thing that was bugging me from the very beginning, of just like looking at Grieco's career up to this point. Like, yeah, he was on 21 Jump Street, but he was only on for a season. And then he got his own show, which lasted a season. I feel like this was a wasted opportunity for someone that could have been better in this role. And I'm not saying any of the actors that I've already mentioned of, who I visualized, but it seems like such a great opportunity and a great concept to risk on someone that wasn't really a cinematic personality, They were a TV personality and they were essentially mocked their entire time on television. So the casting of him is still a huge mystery to me of like, why did they go with this guy? It wasn't written that way originally. He didn't have the popularity with the fan base that this movie, I think, was made for. Teenage girls who watched 21 Jump Street for Johnny Depp were the girls that would have tuned in for Richard Grieco. The film is written for people like you and me back in the day. It's got a lot of action. It's got a lot of sexiness. It's got a lot of tongue-in-cheek humor and a lot of dude humor, you know? Like, the way I look at it is Richard Grieco's character is essentially Robert Downey Jr.'s character in Weird Science. It's just kind of like that borderline bully, wise-ass character, right? I don't want to see a whole movie with that character in it, and that's kind of what we get here. And by the time that character personality flips, I'm kind of over it, and I'm just waiting for the next action scene to happen.
Yeah, I can agree. And that comes to negotiations with the casting director, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I mean, there's got to be something, and I'm sure Grieco's agent almost probably begged to be in this movie to get him out of his comfort zone. But I think when it comes to when you were talking, it just made me think of the areola scene with the sexiness. And I think that is a pivotal scene because we take, I don't know, Michael J. Fox per se, and let's say we have him in that role. How do you make that role sexy and not over the top silly or farce? And I think when it comes to Grieco in that scene, he matches that scene to a T, I would say. But if we put anybody else that's a little bit more geeky, that's where I think the unbalance would come, where it seems way too silly. But I'm trying to think of anybody else that would be able to do that role and balance it. Rico's too stiff and Michael J. Fox is too nerdy. So I think there's no right answer on who would actually execute this to a proper T that I can think of off the top of my head in the 90s. I think it would almost end up in the same kind of debate that we have, only heavy sided on one or the other.
Well, and I think that's where the screenwriter versus the story writer, the conflicts in the film are really evident in how they contradict each other. So, for example, that scene to me just doesn't work. It works that, yes, she would try and seduce him, but in my opinion, it's like, well, if he's such like this horn dog anyway, yeah, the combat condoms is a good sight gag. You know, you need a can opener to open them. But at the same time, I'm not convinced that his character is unfamiliar in the ways of physical love at this point. But if you throw someone in there who this is their first time and they're a virgin and they're nervous and they're playing like, oh yeah, I got you, but then behind the bathroom door, they're all, oh shit, I can't get this open. To me, that's a better laugh because I didn't laugh at that scene. I didn't think it was funny. I thought her performance of having a scorpion in her dress and the music playing was very, very funny and enlightening, but it had nothing to do with what Grieco was doing. So, yeah, I think at the end of the day, my final statement on that is there's a lot going on here that's a lot of fun. I'm not a fan of the main cast member. And I think that it was a conflict and contradiction between what the story writer originally envisioned and what the screenwriter actually ended up writing. Because there are moments where I feel that they just don't feel like the same movie, but there's so much fun and there's so much violence and there's so many great supporting characters that it doesn't really break the experience for me.
Yeah, I'll just say this to close that up is that scene to me, I don't think was meant to work. I think that was meant for the exact audience of teenage boys wanting to see Carole Davis moan on a bed. I'll just say that.
Probably. All right, well, let's hear what these guys had to say.
Film is called If Looks Could Kill, and this is sort of an adolescent James Bond action picture, a trivial one at that, starring Richard Grieco from the TV show Booker as a smart aleck teenager student who takes a trip to Paris with his high school French class only to be mistaken as an American spy. I know If Looks Could Kill wasn't made for me, but that doesn't mean it had to be written so slightly. I guess I think high school students are a lot brighter than they're presented in this picture. And one more problem, the villains aren't particularly threatening, which is a big mistake in a picture like this. Linda Hunt, the fine actress, plays her character for laughs, and I wasn't laughing at them.
I think you and I both disagree with Gene on that statement where the villains aren't necessarily threatening. I think that they are doing exactly what they should be doing. I think Roger Rees, and you said it offline, that, you know, he is like the perfect James Bond villain archetype. He really is. A lot of James Bond villains aren't particularly threatening in their performance. It's their motives that are threatening, right? If anything, most of them are like borderline mad geniuses that have henchmen to do all the dirty work for them. And that's how this works. You know, so like Ziegfeld is very dangerous and he's a psychotic hitman. And Linda Hunt is a more calculated one, but she is so dangerous because no one would expect her to be a hitman. I mean, she's essentially on that plane taking people out without anyone noticing. Yeah, I don't know why he used those words to explain that villain dynamic. It doesn't make sense to me.
It really doesn't, because the Ziegfeld character is like the Jaws of the Bond. So
He really is. Yeah, 100%.
Every character here is interesting and threatening. I mean, you have a 4'9" older woman with a necklace whip that again takes everybody out that she encounters. You have a guy with a gold iron claw that one swipe will cut your skin right there. So, or stop a vehicle or get your body out of a vehicle. So there's a lot of threatening and interest here. And this, I don't think I can really picture why Gene didn't find something out of these villains to find interesting. To me, these actors actually perform the way they're intended to do. And again, we spoke to it earlier, where these performers actually have to hold up this movie. And I think they do a fantastic job on doing that. Even towards the end, it's when we have that ballroom with the champagne, these are really tense moments to me that I really find, if it wasn't for the characters, I wouldn't care less about that dead stare between Grieco and Rees. So to me, I 100% disagree on Gene's analysis, specifically on the villains.
And, you know, I will say that he's got a point when it comes to how they are portraying the archetype of the dumb high school student. And that's another thing that I really noticed is like everyone on that bus is dumb and his best friend is kind of sketchy. You know, the fact that the girl he's sitting next to, he almost puts his tongue in her ear while she's asleep. I was like, what is that? But again, maybe there's some parts of the script that were left out that didn't get shot, or they just didn't get edited into the movie. I'm sure there's a lot there to explain that. But at the same time, like, that's his best friend. So it just goes again to me like questioning, is this guy good enough to be our hero? So I'll give him that part. But also, that's what the movie is. The movie is about a high school student getting mistaken for a spy and eventually having to become a spy. That's where I've talked about this before with Gene, is like, why does he look for logic in movies that beg not to be taken logically or literally? It makes no sense. It's like he doesn't know what he's going into. But Roger, on the other hand, knows exactly what this movie was trying to do.
Gene, I think this movie comes into the category of guilty pleasure for me. I think she plays the character for laughs because it's supposed to be a comedy, but apart from that,
Of course she does, and I didn't laugh at the joke.
It seemed to me that it was going to be the kind of dumb formula that you've reviewed, but then as it went along, it picked up steam and courage. It wanted to go over the top. It wanted to be manic. It wanted to be bizarre. I don't think I've recently seen a scene in which a French high school class from Detroit is suspended in a cage above a cauldron of bubbling molten gold before.
Probably not.
I think that the movie actually has a lot of fun taking those chances. It sold me.
The fact that it's trying those chances, okay, I'll laugh if they're funny. I'm sitting there not laughing at it. I thought the kid as a hero could have been just so much smarter. I mean, I think high school kids are smarter. Why not write it smart?
This is not a movie about a smart high school kid. What can I tell you?
So I kind of agree with Gene towards the end of that, where I feel that if this film had been written for a smarter yet less confident teenager, yes, it would have changed the whole dynamic of the movie. But I also think that it would have given me a lot more reason to support that character than I do the character that we're given. I just have a hard time supporting him. But Roger's right, in my opinion. Like, this movie isn't begging to be understood. It's very obvious of what it's trying to be and what it wants to be. And that's what you and I have talked about many times, where it's like sometimes Gene just doesn't want to get on the bus. He doesn't want to get on the ride. He wants to sit there and deconstruct and analyze the ride of why is this ride not fun for me? It's like, because you're not letting it. Like, you are intentionally not letting the fun happen. And sometimes he's really good at not doing that, but most of the time it's his operation, right? It's his modus operandi to not like fun sometimes. Now, if this was a total spoof, if this was Top Secret, he'd probably have a different story because it's painted in that satire, right? Where this film really isn't. This film, Fred Decker style, is really throwing multiple genres at you. And if you get on the ride, you're going to have fun with it. And that's what Roger does.
Yeah, he wanted a smart character, high school student, slapstick comedy. I get it. So, and I think he's given too much credit to how we analyze high school students. And they don't need to be smart. Why do they need to be smart? They're just graduating, they're on a trip. So, Grieco, name any 18-year-old that goes on a trip that's going to appear smart. They're having fun, they're celebrating. There's no character or high school student here that doesn't really meet the criteria of seriousness. Do I agree that maybe they could have used some relief on that bus when it comes to a normal character? Absolutely, because that could have actually added to the norm of this high school class. I think that needed a little bit more, but I don't think that he gets it or he even knows what he wants from this movie, because it's not supposed to be that serious where they're analyzing how intelligent our high schoolers are, because they're high schoolers. They're trying to portray high schoolers. We're not going to sit there and have high schoolers make intelligent decisions. You have a guy shaving on the bus and then sipping on it. Tell me you don't know that guy in high school. So
Yeah.
to me, I think the analysis is wrong. And I think this is an aspect of Gene that he was expecting something completely different and something that he wanted from it. And Roger said something that is the hardest piece to it, which is it gains steam. 90% of the times movie like this lose steam. And this is a movie, I think he's absolutely right. It does gain steam because we consistently in this movie find things to engage ourselves into these characters and the stakes. And I think that is where Roger really nails it, is talking about the gaining steam on it, because that is the strongest piece of this movie that most movies fail in when they're trying to execute a concept like this.
I'm going to throw another movie from 1991 that this film really reminded me of. And as I started appreciating what this film was giving me, it made me realize why the other film, which I do like, where it fails. And that's Hudson Hawk. This feels like a very similar vibe and style that Hudson Hawk was trying to represent. And this has been my problem with Hudson Hawk from the very beginning. The first half, I think, is fun as hell. The second half pisses me off. It just fails. It loses energy, it loses steam, and it gets really scatterbrained. This one does the opposite. It kind of starts a little scatterbrained, and then it does build momentum, and I was invested in the film and the story. Not so much the character, but everything else about it. So I will say that I actually like this more than Hudson Hawk now. And Hudson Hawk is like a guilty pleasure. It's a love it or hate it movie. And I've always been more on the side of like, okay, I really, really like Hudson Hawk, but I deal with the last half because I love the first half so much. And I can say the same thing for this film, but I can flip it around. It's like, I just didn't really like that first part, but then once it gets going, I really kind of do like it. So yeah, like I don't hate this movie, man. And is it a thumbs up for me? Well, you know me, I really don't like to rate movies. I will watch this again. I will. Like, you got me to the point where it's like, okay, I will show this to somebody. I will experience this again. I probably won't buy it, but I definitely want to watch it again.
Got him. I got you to say
you
it.
got me.
So, and I agree. So, I mean, there's a lot of elements. I'm glad you brought up the Hudson Hawk because that's one of my greatest guilty pleasures too. And I agree with it. It does kind of lose steam to it. But the elements here all work. And to me, this is not, and I don't want this quoted because this is the first time I've actually brought out a movie poster. But I just wanted to do it to shove it in your face. But it's not a great movie, but it is an entertaining one. And it is one that I think was just gone under the radar over the 90s and just kind of written off. And I think this one does deserve, at least for the pure entertainment aspect of it, does deserve to have people watch it and view it just to be purely entertained. So don't expect Shakespeare, don't expect perfect performances because that's not what this movie is. Turn off your brain. And these are one of those movies that know this is the movie they want to make and they execute that to a flawless aspect.
Yeah, and like half the movies on my shelf are literally that, man, where it's like, these aren't great movies, but I love them and the rewatchability factor is high. So I think that when it comes down to it, I'm going to give my critic, Gene Siskel, a D on this review because it's not like he didn't understand the assignment. He didn't want to understand the assignment. It's like he walked into this film with a bias right from the start. And I don't know if that's because of a Greek. He probably doesn't even know who Richard Grieco is. But I think that he is such a fan of both spy films and satire films that since this one exists in a world where those two are kind of blended, it doesn't work for him because it's not truly representing the two genres that he really likes separately. It either has to be more action or more fun and satire. He doesn't like this blend. And so he is going to pick apart the creativity of this film and why it is. I'm not going to say it's like breaking the mold. Lots of movies have done this formula before. But for 1991 and for where cinema was at the time, I mean, we are in the year of Terminator 2, right? This doesn't feel like the right kind of movie for cinema audiences at that moment. And that's kind of ballsy for me. I think that is probably why it didn't succeed at the box office or people gave it a chance because this is a relic of the 80s. I felt that I was watching an 80s movie and then had to remember it's 1991 and it just doesn't feel like a 90s movie to me. And I think audiences probably felt the same way.
Yeah, I mean, that's completely fair because this is a typical 80s style, but in the 90s. So I get that. But when it comes to Roger, I think this one is one that really resonated with me because he states the words that I felt walking out of this movie when I saw it in the theater, which is complete fantasy. I related with the situation. It's that situation that, again, a lot of teenagers can kind of daydream about from some element in this movie. And I like the way he phrased it. And I think he resonated with a lot of the readers and viewers that watched his review. He put in a quote that says, "If looks could kill, is one of those zany capers that come along occasionally to remind us of the pleasures of wrenched access." And this is exactly that, is just something that is just so completely disastrous that actually goes upon that. It builds upon that. And I really do appreciate that wording on it. So to me, I think his review is pretty spot on to the audience this movie was trying to do. So to me, I'm giving him a solid 3 stars on it because I think he spoke to the viewer on what this movie was intended to do.
I'm going to do something a little bit uncouth for us. I'm going to read a snippet from the New York Times review from Stephen Holden that really kind of summed up the way I felt about this movie, and it was kind of cool to see someone else say it. And it says, "The film's great, but its fatal flaw is the charmless performance of its star who displays so little enthusiasm that in looking for signs of life, Mr. Grieco's problems can be blamed partly on the director who plunks him into some potentially funny situation, but then leaves him stranded without a clue as how to proceed." That honestly is like the best way to explain my feelings for it, is that there are moments where Grieco just doesn't know what to do. Like he can't catch up with the energy of the scene. The first time I really noticed that is the scene where he's brought into essentially the MI6 building, where they're showing him all the cool toys and gadgets and and the cars, like all that fun spy stuff, and he seems so unimpressed by all of it. I'm like, dude, you are in the underworld of the spy agency, and they're showing you all this cool stuff, and you feel like, oh, I'm just like on another boring field trip looking at museum artifacts and things like that. It's not until the car shows up that he gets excited. It just didn't work for me. And this guy blames it on the director. I'm sorry, I blame it on Grieco. I feel that if Grieco knew what this role really was and what this character was, there would have been a different enthusiasm into what he was seeing and what he was being asked to do. Because to kind of prove Gene's point, to only be excited once the car shows up, it really is a dumb teenager dynamic.
I think we both know at the end of the day, when it comes to character direction, it's the director's fault to the most part. But it almost fits his personality. And I don't know, this one might be open for debate that it matches Grieco when the car shows up and it's the only pretty thing that shows up on screen that's the interesting thing that it has. But I agree that there needed to be something not necessarily in the character direction here, but in the writing, because there is little lines given from Rico in this scene that really shows anything of interest. So I think that scene in particular was a mixed bag of mistakes that could have been written a lot better, because it is an engaging scene. The shots that our director does is engaging. The performances and the dialogue are not. So I think that
Yeah.
wouldn't be Greco's fault per se, but I think he does add to the staleness of it on the delivery. But in my opinion, I think that's going to be, at the end of the day, going to be the director's problem on his character direction.
This is me like taking a weird step away from that main conversation, because I rarely say this of like, how would I fix this film? What would I have liked to see this film do? Well, we've already seen it change its genre pattern consistently throughout the movie, where it's comedy, then action, suspense, and all these different things. And it got me thinking about Gabriel Anwar's character, who I feel is underutilized in this movie. In my mind, like, how cool would it have been if Richard Grieco starts the movie out for us, right? And then in the second act, when he meets Mariska, then she takes over and becomes the badass. And we follow her through the rest of the movie. Because again, that's just one more problem. You give us a very interesting and very attractive character that we really want to see more of, and we really don't get to. We have to like watch her tag along with Grieco when she's got the bigger motivation. She's trying to avenge her father, Roger Daltrey. I'm like, I want that movie. So if I had to tweak and if I had to fix, that's what I would have done, is I would have really changed the focus of the rest of the direction onto her, and then let Grieco be the, little daisy chain, follow the leader type character, because that could have been fun too.
I love that, because Gabriella Anwar I love it. She was my crush of the 90s after For Love or Money, and she is one of those that I would have gladly seen that Superman syndrome come from it, where it's this very subtle
100%.
character that turns into a
Yeah.
badass. She is completely underutilized in this, and I think she is better than that, and I'm sad to say that she hasn't had the best career after this movie, except for Love and Money. In my opinion, that's great. But I think,
Oh, don't forget about Wild Hearts Can't Be Broken, man.
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
That might end up on the list. I don't know.
But I think that would have actually made it better, because at the second half of the movie, it's all about the villains. It's all about the supporting cast. And I think that is a brilliant suggestion. And I think that would have appeased my teenage heart as well.
I liked this movie more than I thought I would. You win. I know you want to take home the trophy, but yeah, I think that this is something that could be easily remade. Like, this definitely has feet. Like, the story's got legs, and I think after Kingsman and after Bourne has been such like a pop culture phenomenon in the last 20 years, I think that this is a genre that could actually really work again. And I'd much rather see something like this be remade than films that are actually good that are getting remade for no reason whatsoever. Twisters, I'm sorry. Like, stuff like that. Give us something more obscure, remake it so we can go back and enjoy the origin, instead of trying to remake something that most people, for the most part, kind of like anyway. I think that's one of the biggest problems we're seeing with remakes right now.
100%. And I'm not a huge fan of saying remake this, but I'm not against remakes. There's something I love to see a different vision of, and even though they fail 99% of the time, but this is one that I would say remake it. Don't change a lot about it. Change the casting, amplify the dialogue, and you might have something there. The main
Make it more dangerous.
Make it more
Make it like
dangerous.
a John Wick time of thing, right?
Absolutely. And this one could really succeed because here's the problem we have with movies today is when it comes to the teenage audience and having something that really pulls them into theaters, we don't have unless it's a horror movie. We don't have unless it's something that screams violence. So this is one of those almost borderline innocent movies that will almost attract, but you have to have that fantasy element. My fear, if this is kind of the rebooted aspect, we're going to lose that. And that is the best piece of that movie is really the fantasy of relatability. And we have all these old farts in Hollywood that have lost that magic of what this audience wants. They go to the studio safe, and that would be my only thing that I would say I wouldn't want to see in a reboot today is because I don't have faith in the filmmakers that would create it. But I think this deserves a reboot because I think this is something that a lot of the 18 to 20 audience needs is something to really remember when they get older.
And it'll give Richard Grieco something to do because you'd have to have the obligatory cameo, right? Although I have no idea what he looks like right now. I'm going to assume not well.
I don't know.
Next week, folks, it's my pick, and I am bringing 1985's Enemy Mine, directed by Wolfgang Peterson. It is a sci-fi film that's essentially a Robin Crusoe story set on a planet far, far away in the future. Dennis Quaid and Louis Gossett Jr., rest in peace. And this is a movie that, again, it's a guilty pleasure for me. I haven't watched it for a while, so I'm really excited for this rewatch, and I'm really excited for the conversation because, like so many films, our critics have opinions on it. So we will hit that next week.
A lot of these movies in the 80s and 90s, it's hard not to be a guilty pleasure, and I think it's a great pick. Can't wait for this conversation.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening. You know what to do. Like, review, rate, subscribe to Back to the Balcony, as well as my show, The Cultworthy, at thecultworthy.com, and Justin Henson's show, The Movie Wire, at
themoviewire.com.
Please send us any suggestions for films that you want us to cover, as long as Siskel and Ebert reviewed it on their show. And we will have some more special episodes of Best of Years and Memos to the Academies. And one of the ones that we haven't done yet is the dogs. We have to get into some of those dog episodes. So stay tuned for more of those. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.